Hey guys, welcome back to the Sleep Atlas. Before we start tonight's journey, take a moment, dim the lights, let the noise of the day dissolve. Wherever you are, you're about to travel somewhere strange, not a place on any official map, but one that lives in whispers, in dust, in the margins of forgotten atlases. This is the story of Tartaria. They say history is written by the victors, but what happens when the victors forget to mention an entire empire? What if there really was a civilization, vast, advanced, beautiful, erased not by time, but by design? A civilization that built cities we can still see, but no longer recognize. Sounds impossible, right? Yet somehow you've probably already seen pieces of it. The old photos of cities with windows buried beneath the streets. The maps labeled Grand Tartary, the ornate architecture that feels out of place as if it belonged to someone else, someone older, someone gone. Now, to be clear, Tartaria isn't a historical fact. It's a theory, a myth, a dream, if you want to be kind. But it's a dream that refuses to die, because at its heart lies something irresistible. The idea that history isn't what we think it is. That we've been handed a world with a few missing chapters, and whether you believe the myth or not, it's hard not to feel something when you see it. So tonight, we're going to drift through that myth together, through maps, ruins, and half-buried cities, through stories of explorers and erased empires, through the dusty edges of history where imagination and memory blur together. And if you fall asleep along the way, that's fine. That's kind of the point. For more journeys through history to help you sleep, please subscribe to the Sleep Atlas. And hey, what's keeping you up tonight? Let me know in the comments. Alright, let's begin. Imagine fog rolling over endless plains, gold grass bending under the wind. You stand before a vast land that feels both ancient and impossible, somewhere between Asia and memory, somewhere once called Tartaria. Chapter 1. The Empire That Never Was, or was it? They called it Grand Tartary. On maps from the 17th and 18th centuries, it sprawled across nearly half of Asia, an empire stretching from the icy edges of Siberia to the mountains of Tibet, from the Pacific all the way to the Caspian Sea. A continent-wide expanse so huge it made Europe look like a backyard garden. But here's the strange thing. When you look closer, it doesn't behave like any other empire on the map. No clear capital, no list of rulers, just a name, Tartaria, floating over deserts and steppes, surrounded by decorative drawings of camels and horsemen. The cartographers might as well have written, "Here be mystery." And yet, for hundreds of years, Western mapmakers copied that name again and again. Tartaria, Grand Tartary, the Great Tartar Empire. Sometimes they drew castles or cities with minarets. Sometimes they left it blank, as if even they didn't know what they were depicting. So what was Tartaria, according to the official story? Nothing. The word Tartary was simply a European catch-all term for the unknown lands of Central and Northern Asia. The people who lived there, Tatars, Mongols, Siberian tribes, were lumped together under one convenient label. To the Europeans of the 1600s, it was the great blurry East, wild, uncivilized, and beyond comprehension. But to modern eyes, it doesn't look like nothing. It looks deliberate, mysterious, like the ghost of something that was once real. And that's where the story starts to hum. Because if you look long enough, if you trace enough old maps, you start to notice inconsistencies. Cities drawn where no cities should exist. Structures too grand for the people historians claim built them. Ruins that don't seem to fit their supposed age. Some believe those ruins were Tartarian, that an advanced civilization, older than Rome, older even than Egypt, once stretched across the world. They say its architecture was sophisticated, its technology almost magical, free energy, perfect symmetry, towering buildings powered not by fire or water but by something lost, something we can no longer name. It sounds absurd, but then you see the photos, black and white images from the late 19th century, cities under construction except everything already looks finished, cathedral-sized buildings supposedly built in a decade, though even modern machinery would struggle, streets half-buried, windows below ground level, as if the earth itself had swallowed the first floors. That's where the mud flood theory enters. According to believers, some great cataclysm, maybe natural, maybe man-made, swept across the world in the 1800s, burying entire cities in mud and erasing all evidence of this lost empire. When humanity dug out afterward, we inherited the world we think we built. In other words, the Victorians didn't build all those ornate cities, they unearthed them. It's easy to roll your eyes, but it's also strangely poetic, because even if Tartaria never existed, the feeling behind it, that something monumental was lost, is very real. And part of why this myth persists is because, well, history does lose things. Entire civilizations have vanished before. The Minoans, the Indus Valley, the Olmecs, people who built incredible cities, traded across oceans, and then disappeared, leaving nothing but stones and speculation. So maybe the idea of Tartaria isn't so far-fetched. Maybe it's a reflection of that same human ache, the need to fill in the gaps with something beautiful. Imagine wandering through a European city at dusk. The sky is pale gold, pigeons circle over rooftops. You walk down a street where the buildings rise like cathedrals, domes, arches, pillars carved in perfect balance. It all feels too good, too symmetrical, too ancient to have been born in the soot and smoke of the industrial age. For a moment you wonder, did we build this, or did we inherit it? The theory of Tartaria taps into that quiet doubt, the sense that somewhere along the way, humanity rebooted, restarted, forgot, and the mud flood is a metaphor for time, for amnesia, for the way civilizations bury their own pasts under layers of progress. It's an idea that's equal parts eerie and comforting, because if there really was a forgotten golden age, maybe the world isn't as random as it seems. Maybe we've been here before. Maybe we'll find it again. And even if it's all a myth, it's a myth that asks good questions. Who decides what counts as history? How much of what we know is just the version that survived? So as we drift deeper into the story, try not to worry about what's true or false. Just imagine the possibility. A civilization erased not by war, not by time, but by forgetting. A memory whispered by wind over empty plains. The empire that never was, or maybe the one we no longer remember. Imagine you're an explorer in the late 1700s. You've left behind the comfortable parlours of London or Paris, the powdered wigs, the smoky taverns, the endless debates about civilization and progress. You're trudging through a landscape so vast it feels like the sky itself is falling toward the horizon. This is the world early explorers called Tartary. Endless plains, windswept deserts, forests that swallow sound. You could ride for weeks without seeing a soul, yet somehow you never feel alone. There's something in the air, the sense that once something grand was here, something old, something that had the decency to leave quietly. Western explorers were baffled by what they found. Vast stone ruins scattered through Central Asia, half-buried fortresses, walls that seemed to go nowhere. Nomadic tribes spoke of ancient cities lost to storms and floods, old temples built by hands they could no longer name. And yet, in their journals, these explorers rarely admitted confusion. Europeans of the Enlightenment were not fans of mystery. They preferred tidy explanations. Primitive people, ancient ruins, nothing to see here. Still, a few of them couldn't quite let it go. In 1755, the English geographer Emmanuel Bowen published a map labeling nearly the entire interior of Asia as Great Tartary. To the west lay Little Tartary, and further south, Independent Tartary. Even China was labeled part of the Great Tartar Empire. Historians later claimed it was simply ignorance. Cartographers didn't know what else to call it. But if you're a conspiracy-minded insomniac scrolling through old atlases at 3 a.m., it starts to look deliberate, like someone drew a curtain over half the world and wrote, "Don't ask." Those maps became the backbone of the Tartarian legend. The idea that there was once a sprawling civilization across Siberia and Central Asia, erased from history and memory alike. And when explorers traveled through those regions, what they described often sounded contradictory. They found nomadic tribes living in tents, herders, hunters, perfectly ordinary people. But they also found traces of things that didn't fit. Ancient irrigation systems, half-buried brickworks, strange mounds that hinted at forgotten settlements. The farther they went, the more surreal it became. In Siberia, there were reports of colossal ruins swallowed by forests. In Mongolia, strange carvings and fortifications half lost to the sands. Some described crumbling citadels near the Altai Mountains, built of stone so precisely fitted it might as well have been cast, not carved. To modern historians, it's no great mystery. Remnants of older cultures, Turkic kingdoms, Mongol fortresses. But to the romantically inclined, it's something else. Evidence, perhaps, of a civilization that once ruled these lands, far older and more advanced than the textbooks admit. And then there's the emptiness, the eerie, silent expanse that made even hardened travelers uneasy. Take the accounts of Peter Simon Pallas, a German naturalist who explored Russia and Siberia in the 1770s. He described vast areas devoid of inhabitants, where ruined settlements lay beside abandoned mines and decayed fortifications. He mentioned rivers cutting through landscapes that seemed to have been reshaped by catastrophe, as though floods or mudslides had swept entire cities away. When his journals were published in Europe, readers found them haunting. The image of a land once filled with life, now reduced to wind and silence. It's here that the myth of the mud flood starts to germinate. The idea that an ancient disaster literally buried a civilization under layers of sediment, windows below street level, doors half submerged, entire first floors beneath the dirt. For believers, that wasn't just geology, it was evidence. And if you've ever walked through an old city, St. Petersburg, Prague, even San Francisco, you might have noticed it too. Streets sitting higher than the building's original entrances, like time itself kept adding layers. Of course, historians say it's just how old cities evolve. Roads get repaved, foundations sink, streets are raised to prevent flooding. But the human imagination doesn't like boring answers. Geological settling doesn't keep you awake at night. The idea of a worldwide cataclysm, though, that does. What's compelling about these explorers' reports is not what they found, but what they felt. The sense that they were moving through someone else's world, one that had been erased. There's a moment in nearly every explorer's journal, the kind that never makes it into the abridged editions, where they sound tired. The grand adventure wears off, and what's left is silence. Cold wind, vast skies, the creak of leather, and a feeling that they are walking through the afterlife of history. They pass strange earthworks, abandoned stone foundations, carvings of faces eroded to anonymity. Sometimes they sketch them, sometimes they move on. Always there's the sense of almost understanding, almost remembering. And maybe that's what Tartaria really is, a landscape of almost history, almost memory, a civilization that feels like it should have existed, even if it didn't. Think about it. How many times has humanity stared at something old and half-broken and said, we could never build that today? It's an illusion, but a powerful one. Standing before ruins or monuments, we see not just stone and mortar, but the faint shadow of our own fragility. We want the past to be smarter than us, nobler than us, more advanced than we deserve. It's easier to believe we're living in the ruins of greatness than to admit that maybe we're the ones who'll be forgotten. So when explorers trudged across those endless Asian plains and saw remnants of something they couldn't explain, it planted a seed, a legend. And legends, once born, never die. They sleep, they wait, they resurface in new forms, on message boards, in YouTube videos, in late-night rabbit holes where half the fun is not believing, but wondering. The Tartarian myth is less about what those explorers found and more about what we want to find, meaning, continuity, proof that the world once made sense and that maybe beneath all this noise and chaos, it still does. Imagine the explorer's campfire. The air is thin and cold. Sparks float upward, swallowed by the night. Somewhere in the distance, wolves call to each other, and above stars shimmer, the same constellations those long-lost Tartarians might have seen if they ever existed at all. The explorer looks out over the dark plain, notebook open, and writes one word on the page, Tartaria, a word that means nothing and everything. They say the earth remembers, every stone, every layer of dirt, every foundation buried beneath a modern street is a diary, written in silence. But if you listen to the believers of the mud flood, the earth doesn't just remember, it hides. Picture this, a city half buried, windows that look out onto soil instead of streets, doorways that open into nothing but packed dirt, buildings whose first floors have vanished beneath layers of earth and time. To most, it's a quirk of old construction. To the followers of Tartaria, it's evidence of something far stranger, a global cataclysm that erased an entire civilization in a single, muddy sigh. The mud flood theory is one of those beautiful modern myths that could only have been born in the age of the internet. It began quietly, like a whisper in digital catacombs, obscure forums, old photography groups, amateur historians trading ideas. Someone noticed something odd, antique photos from the 1800s showing cities with half-buried buildings, windows at ground level, strange architectural anachronisms. Then someone else noticed the same thing somewhere else, and suddenly a pattern emerged, or seemed to. If you stare at enough old photos for long enough, patterns start to appear everywhere. And soon the whispers took form. What if history isn't what we think it is? What if there was a reset, a literal flood of mud that buried the old world, wiped it clean, and left us to rebuild on top of its bones? It sounds ridiculous, but also admit it. It's a little bit seductive. Let's take a closer look at what this story really says. According to the myth, sometime in the 18th or 19th century, dates are always vague, an immense cataclysm struck the earth. Not water, but mud, thick, heavy, suffocating mud that rolled over cities like a blanket, swallowing buildings, streets, even entire civilizations. What survived was what we now call our world, a reset civilization built atop the ruins of the one before. The theory claims we are the survivors of an amnesiac world living in the shadow of a forgotten age. And once you start looking for it, you see it everywhere. Old photographs of St. Petersburg, where neoclassical buildings seem to have half their height underground. Doorways that lead nowhere in Istanbul. Strange window wells in San Francisco. Cathedrals whose ground floors appear oddly misaligned with the modern streets around them. The world, it seems, is full of buried stories. But here's where the magic, or the mischief, lies. Context. Cities grow, streets rise, pavements get repaved, foundations sink, earthquakes shift land. Engineers, bless their pragmatic hearts, have been dealing with that since ancient Mesopotamia. It's normal, but the human imagination doesn't want normal. It wants wonder. It wants the cosmic version of a plot twist. And so the mud flood became that twist, a grand, tragic reset that could explain the strangeness of the world, the impossible beauty of old architecture, the missing centuries, the ruins that look too modern to be ancient and too ancient to be modern. It's not hard to see why the theory stuck. It scratches two primal itches, the fear that we've forgotten something vital, and the hope that once humanity reached heights we can barely comprehend. It's a bedtime story for adults who no longer trust bedtime stories. Imagine it, the great cities of the past humming with energy and knowledge, star-shaped fortresses aligning with the heavens, towers crowned with gilded domes, machines powered not by coal or electricity but by sound, magnetism, or divine geometry. A golden age washed away in silence, leaving behind half-buried clues for the curious to rediscover centuries later. It's haunting, isn't it? The thought that the ground beneath your feet might be hiding a version of civilization more graceful, more harmonious, and, let's be honest, less exhausting than this one. The most poetic versions of the myth don't even insist on global destruction. They suggest something subtler. That time itself buried Tartaria. That the mud is just metaphor. The weight of centuries pressing down until memory sank into soil. That our cities grew atop their bones, and we live in their echoes without even realizing it. But even the literal believers, the ones who pore over 19th century photographs and Google Earth screenshots, are chasing something more than evidence. They're chasing awe, the sense that the world is not yet fully explained, that maybe, just maybe, there are still secrets hiding in plain sight. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. We like feeling small, not powerless, just small. The idea that we are part of something vast, mysterious, and older than we can imagine brings comfort. It means our anxieties, our endless scrolling, our late-night insomnia, they're all just surface noise above something deeper, older, wiser. The mud flood myth, for all its implausibility, taps into that longing. It's also, in a strange way, an act of defiance. In an age where algorithms decide what we see and experts tell us what to believe, the mud flood says, "No, I'll look for myself." It's a rebellion of curiosity, however misguided. And curiosity, even when it wanders off the map, is still one of the noblest human instincts. There's another reason the mud flood myth feels oddly soothing. It provides closure. History as we know it is messy. It's full of gaps, contradictions, burned archives, and lost languages. But if you say, it was all wiped out by a cataclysm, suddenly everything makes sense. The missing records, buried, the inconsistent architecture, survivors of the old world, The sense that things used to be better, proof of what we lost. It's a complete narrative, simple, self-contained, emotionally satisfying. And if you whisper it softly enough, it almost sounds plausible. But let's pause for a moment. Imagine walking through one of these mud-flood cities today. St. Petersburg in winter, snow falling over pale facades, the streets gleaming under the dim orange glow of street lamps. You pass a row of 18th century buildings, their ground floors half below street level, the windows dark and shuttered. And for a second, just a second, you feel it. The hum of something ancient, the faint vibration of time layered upon time. You know rationally that the explanation is boring, centuries of road repairs and architectural evolution. But your imagination doesn't care. It leans closer, it listens, it wants to believe. That's the quiet power of myths like Tartaria. They live not in evidence, but in emotion. And emotion, not logic, is what builds civilizations, or stories of them. So when someone insists the world was buried in mud a few hundred years ago, it's tempting to laugh, but look closer, and you'll see what they're really saying. They're mourning something they can't name. They're trying to make peace with the feeling that something's missing. That modern life, bright, loud, and efficient, feels a little hollow, as if the real story is still underground. And maybe, in a metaphorical way, it is. Not beneath our cities, but beneath our certainty. History is the soil we stand on, and every generation adds another layer. The deeper you dig, the older the questions get, until eventually you realize that the mud was never hiding the past. It was making it. The world is built on burial, and everything beautiful is, in some sense, reclaimed from the dirt. So maybe Tartaria was never an empire at all. Maybe it's an idea, a longing for the lost wholeness of things. Or maybe it's just a very elaborate excuse for why so many basements flood in spring. Take your pick. Either way, as the night deepens and your thoughts drift like dust in lamplight, the question lingers: if an entire civilization could be buried under centuries of mud and forgetfulness, would we even recognize it when we uncovered it? Or would we mistake it for ruins of our own? It's a strange thing, how ruins can feel alive. You walk among them and swear you can hear breathing. Not loud, not human, but the slow exhale of stone, the whisper of time smoothing edges and swallowing stories. That's the allure of forgotten grandeur, the feeling that the past isn't gone, just drowsing, half buried, half awake, waiting for someone to notice. When people speak of Tartaria, they don't imagine mud and dust. They imagine beauty, colossal arches, glittering domes, towers capped with orbs of gold, and wide boulevards aligned with the stars. They imagine symmetry, harmony, perfection, the world before we made it messy. And that's the quiet genius of the myth. It isn't built on fear, but on longing. You've seen it, even if you didn't recognize it. The grand railway stations built in the 19th century, dripping with ornament that seems almost too elegant for its purpose. The courthouses with domes that look more celestial than civic. The cathedrals rising from cobblestone streets like frozen thunderclaps of devotion. You stand before these buildings and wonder, who built this, and why don't we build like this anymore? That question is the ember that keeps Tartaria glowing in the imagination, because it feels wrong that we've forgotten how to make beauty on that scale. It feels wrong that we can't carve marble with such grace, or erect domes that kiss the clouds. And when something feels wrong, the human mind looks for a story to explain it. Tartaria becomes that story, a civilization that mastered form, function, and soul, then vanished without a trace. Some say those old buildings are Tartarian relics, that the ornate facades of St. Petersburg, Paris, Chicago, and even San Francisco are remnants of the same world, a world whose architecture was an act of faith. That the reason we can't replicate it now is because the knowledge was erased, the formulas for harmony, for proportion, for power drawn from geometry, gone, buried under new blueprints and the hum of electric wires. Of course, historians roll their eyes at this. They'll tell you, patiently, that these buildings were designed by very real architects, that neoclassicism was an artistic movement, not evidence of a hidden empire, that the beauty of those domes and arches came not from secret knowledge, but from mathematics, sweat, and a lot of unpaid apprentices. And they're right, technically. But here's the thing. Beauty doesn't care about technicalities. The Tartarian myth persists because these buildings feel different. They hum at a frequency modern architecture doesn't. Walk past a concrete office block and your mind slides off it. Walk past a century-old opera house and you slow down without meaning to. You feel something, a pulse. Maybe it's nostalgia, maybe it's resonance, maybe it's just the echo of a time when craftsmanship was an act of worship. But whatever it is, it feels alive. Imagine standing at twilight in front of one of those old structures. The stone glows amber. The carvings seem to move in the shifting light. You can almost believe the building is remembering itself, its birth, its purpose, its centuries of reign and revolution. That's the spell of forgotten grandeur. The architecture isn't just old, it's haunted by the idea of meaning, and when meaning vanishes, mystery rushes in to fill the space. Tartaria thrives in that mystery. It offers an explanation for why the world feels simultaneously ancient and amnesiac, why progress sometimes feels like forgetting, why the cities of the past, those that survived wars, plagues, and fires, still look more eternal than anything we've built since. Modern life gives us glass towers and efficiency. Tartaria promises something slower, something that glows, a civilization that built not for profit or speed but for resonance, structures designed to outlast memory itself. It's an irresistible dream, because whether or not Tartaria existed, the feeling it represents is real, the ache for beauty that doesn't apologize for existing, for craftsmanship that outlives its makers, for a sense of belonging to something both vast and intentional. That's why the myth never fully dies. People share photographs of star-shaped forts, cathedrals that look like spaceships, and ornate courthouses buried halfway underground, whispering, "Look, this can't just be random." And maybe they're right, though not in the way they think, because what they're really seeing isn't proof of a lost empire. It's proof of a lost mindset. A time when humanity built upward and outward with a kind of faith we've since replaced with convenience. Take St. Isaac's Cathedral in St. Petersburg. It looks like it shouldn't exist. A colossal dome balanced on rows of red granite columns covered in gold that blazes even through fog. Inside, the marble floors mirror the heavens, and the ceilings are painted with saints so vivid they seem alive. Visitors describe it as overwhelming, transcendent, but the Tartarian imagination sees something else, evidence. They ask how such grandeur could be built in the early 1800s by hand in a place that was supposedly swamp and snow. They ask why the foundations look so deep, as if the building once stood taller. Historians give answers: scaffolding, imported granite, decades of work. But believers see a gap, and gaps, as we know, are where myths thrive. It's comforting in a way, because when you believe in Tartaria, you believe that someone once got it right, that the world once understood balance, proportion, light, and energy, that humans long ago built in tune with the earth instead of against it. It's a prettier story than the truth that history is mostly a series of accidents that occasionally produce beauty by mistake. And yet, even if the story is wrong, the emotion behind it is not. There's something deeply human about looking at ruins and imagining paradise, about standing in front of a crumbling palace and whispering, "Who were you? What did you know that we've forgotten?" We do this everywhere. In the jungles of Cambodia, staring at Angkor Wat, in the deserts of Egypt, under the shadow of the pyramids, in the mountains of Peru, among the terraces of Machu Picchu. We look at beauty that endures and assume it must have come from a civilization wiser than ours. Maybe it didn't, but maybe the impulse to think so says more about us than about them. Because really, the myth of Tartaria isn't about lost knowledge, it's about lost reverence. We miss believing that beauty meant something, that it wasn't an accessory, but a form of truth. That stone could hold memory, and domes could sing. So when you see those impossible old buildings and feel that small, unexplainable ache, don't rush to fill it with conspiracy. Let it linger. That ache is the story. It's the ghost of wonder, tapping you on the shoulder, reminding you that history is not a timeline. It's a mood, a long, slow chord, still resonating beneath the noise. And maybe that's what Tartaria really is, the echo of a world that believed in harmony more than speed, a civilization of imagination, built not in stone, but in longing. So as you drift deeper into this story, eyes heavy, thoughts softening, remember this: whether Tartaria was real or not, the beauty it promises was. You can still walk through it, touch it, breathe it in brick and marble and dusk. It's there, waiting quietly behind every ornate facade and every buried window. Forgotten grandeur, humming in the walls. There's something strange about ideas that shouldn't survive, yet somehow do. Tartaria is one of them. Every few decades it slips back into conversation like a ghost that refuses to stay buried. A whisper here, a map there, a photograph that feels off. Too ornate, too advanced, too forgotten. It persists not because it's proven, but because it's beautiful. You see, real history doesn't linger in our imaginations the same way myths do. Facts settle, myths breathe, and Tartaria breathes in the spaces history forgot to fill. It's almost poetic, how a rumor can live longer than an empire. How a half-remembered word on an antique map, Tartary, can spark entire worlds in the modern mind. Because the truth is, humans don't remember data, we remember stories. And this one, it's irresistible. A world erased, a golden age hidden beneath our feet. The paradox of Tartaria is that it survives precisely because it never existed. A real empire would have ended, decayed, been replaced, but something that never was can never truly die. It hovers in imagination, endlessly renewable, unprovable, untouchable. The perfect myth for the digital age, weightless, viral, and infinitely remixable. Scroll through YouTube or Reddit and you'll see it. Old photographs of grand cityscapes labeled Tartarian architecture, posts about star forts and buried windows, endless debates about free energy, hidden cataclysms and lost technology, thousands of comments beneath them, people saying things like, "I've always felt something was off about history." It's not about belief, it's about belonging. The myth offers comfort to anyone who looks at the modern world and feels like something essential slipped through our fingers. Maybe that's the real allure. Tartaria gives shape to a feeling we all have but rarely admit, that somewhere along the way, humanity traded mystery for machinery. We built faster, higher, louder, but maybe not better. We paved over silence, replaced curiosity with certainty, and called it progress. And when that certainty began to crack, when our cities started to feel soulless, our histories fragmented, people began looking backward, not for answers, but for meaning. It's easy to mock that impulse. Historians roll their eyes, scientists sigh. But behind the internet rabbit holes and Photoshop theories lies something genuine, a hunger for enchantment, a longing to believe that the past wasn't just dirt and survival, but art and light and knowledge we've somehow misplaced. And in that sense, Tartaria isn't a conspiracy, it's a lullaby, a story people tell themselves when the modern world feels too sterile, too linear, too loud, a bedtime tale for adults who sense that truth might not always fit inside textbooks. Think about it. We've mapped the Earth, decoded the genome, photographed black holes, and yet we're still drawn to mystery. It's like a gravity our species can't escape. Tartaria gives us that gravity in soft, dreamlike form. A lost world that never judges, never contradicts, never ends, because it was never real enough to die. But here's the thing, even myths can tell truths. They tell us what we miss, what we value, what we quietly wish could come back. When people imagine Tartaria, what they're really longing for isn't a lost empire, it's coherence. A sense that the world once made sense, that knowledge was sacred, that beauty and purpose weren't at odds. In a way, Tartaria is less about history and more about therapy, a collective daydream for a civilization that feels spiritually jet-lagged. We scroll through endless feeds, flickering between wars, gadgets, and memes, and somewhere inside a voice whispers, "Wasn't there supposed to be more than this?" Tartaria answers softly, "Yes, there was, or maybe there could have been." And so the myth persists, traveling through forums and documentaries and late-night conversations, wrapping itself in fog and marble. It survives because it speaks to something the Enlightenment forgot, that mystery itself has value, that not knowing is sometimes more comforting than knowing. But here's the paradox. Tartaria's greatest gift isn't in proving itself true. It's in reminding us that belief is part of what makes us human, that even in an age of algorithms, we still crave wonder. We still want to stand before something vast and say, "I don't understand, but it feels sacred." Maybe that's why late at night you find yourself staring at photos of old cities, their streets glimmering with gaslight, their domes fading into fog, and feel that tug in your chest. It's not nostalgia for Tartaria. It's nostalgia for awe, for the feeling of being small beneath something magnificent, something that doesn't explain itself. So as you lie there now, the room dim, the hum of the modern world soft around you, imagine that somewhere, beneath centuries of soil, beneath stories and skepticism, there's a quiet city still dreaming. Its towers shimmer faintly under the weight of time. Its fountains murmur in forgotten languages, and if you listen long enough, you can almost hear it, the heartbeat of the world before we named it. They called it Tartaria. Maybe it never was, but its echo, soft, patient, luminous, still lingers. Drift with it for a while. Let the questions fade. You don't need answers tonight, only the wonder. Chapter 2. The Real Tartars, Nomads, Empires, and Misunderstood Worlds. Let's take a breath. We've wandered through the fog of myth, through maps that hum with impossible empires and ruins that seem to remember more than they should. But now it's time to peel back the dream and look at the ground beneath it, the soil, the wind, and the people who actually lived there. Because behind every legend lies something real, even if it's been twisted beyond recognition. So let's step out onto the steppe. Imagine yourself standing somewhere between Russia, Mongolia, and Kazakhstan. Not today, but thousands of years ago. There are no borders here, no lines on a map, no marble cities, just horizon, an ocean of grass rolling under a sky so wide it makes you dizzy. The air smells like dust and horses. The sound of wind is constant, threading through tall stalks of feather grass. This is the birthplace of what Europe once called Tartary. Not a single empire, but a world of motion, a civilization without walls. To Western minds, this landscape always felt alien. How could a people rule without cities? How could a culture thrive without monuments? To the steppe nomads, that question would have sounded absurd. Their monuments were movement. Their empire was the horizon itself. Centuries before anyone drew Tartaria on a map, there were the Scythians, archers and horsemen who painted their bodies, buried their dead in golden tombs, and drank fermented mare's milk. The Greeks feared them, the Persians tried to conquer them, and yet they moved like smoke, impossible to hold. Herodotus called them a people who have no towns, no walls, no fixed abode, as if that made them lesser. But in truth, it made them free. The Scythians mastered the horse long before Rome even dreamed of chariots. They stitched their world together with leather, not mortar. They carried fire in bronze cauldrons, slept beneath felt tents, and worshipped gods of wind, sun, and sky. To them, the land wasn't empty. It was alive, a vast breathing plain where everything connected through motion and story. After the Scythians came the Sarmatians, then the Huns, then the Turkic Khaganates. The names shifted, but the rhythm stayed the same. Nomads rising like storms, surging westward, reshaping everything in their path. They raided, traded, intermarried, and vanished into the mist again, leaving behind only graves and legends. And so, by the time medieval mapmakers in Europe began sketching the world, this enormous, ungovernable space had already become a myth. To them it was a blank, the unknown lands beyond the Christian world, filled with monsters, giants, and Tartars. That word, Tartar, wasn't even theirs. It came from outsiders, likely twisted from the name of a Turkic tribe, the Tartars, with a dash of poetic menace added. Medieval Europeans thought it sounded like Tartarus, the Greek underworld, so they called these nomads Tartars, as if they'd come from hell itself. You can almost hear the shiver in the name, but the truth was far more complicated and far more interesting. These weren't demons, they were people. Traders, horsemen, mothers, poets. They lived lives as rich as any Roman senators, just measured differently. Picture a nomadic camp at sunset. The steppe glows gold. Horses graze on the horizon, their coats shimmering in the low light. Fires crackle as women stir pots of milk and millet. Children chase each other between felt tents, yurts, their laughter carried by the wind. Men return from herding, their bows slung over shoulders, dust clinging to their boots. The air smells faintly of smoke and grass. Somewhere, a throat singer begins a low, resonant song, and the notes ripple across the plain like the hum of the earth itself. This was their Rome. Not a city of marble, but of motion and memory. And to them the West's obsession with stone walls would have seemed as strange as worshipping stillness. But as centuries rolled on, stillness began to win. Empires like China, Persia, and eventually Russia pushed outward, trying to tame the steppe. They built forts, drew borders, demanded tribute. The nomads resisted, then adapted. They traded horses for silk, hides for grain, freedom for survival. Slowly, their infinite world began to shrink. By the time European explorers stumbled across these lands in the 17th and 18th centuries, the old steppe empires were fading. The Scythians were long gone. The Mongols' great Khanates had fractured. The once fluid borders had hardened into lines on parchment, and those lines, curved by ignorance, exaggerated by imagination, became the first maps of Tartary. To the west, it looked like a mystery, an empire that wasn't quite there, a vast, seemingly empty space once teeming with civilizations that had vanished. But to those who lived there, it wasn't emptiness, it was memory. The bones of ancestors beneath the grass, the hum of stories in the wind, the echo of hoofbeats across the centuries. And maybe that's where the myth begins to make sense, because when you stand on a plain that stretches to the horizon in every direction, it's easy to believe that time itself might fold here, that something ancient could still be sleeping under the soil. Perhaps the world didn't erase Tartaria at all. Perhaps it just forgot how to see it. Let's be honest, Europe never really understood Asia, not in the Middle Ages, not in the Renaissance, and arguably not even now. For centuries, the lands east of Moscow and west of China were less a geographic reality and more a psychological one, an enormous blank space where anything could exist. And in that blankness, the idea of Tartary began to grow like a mirage. Imagine a candlelit room in Venice, sometime around the 14th century. A mapmaker hunches over his parchment, hands stained with ink. On the table beside him lie fragments of rumors, sailors' tales, merchant gossip, and a half-remembered account of a man named Marco Polo, who claimed to have seen palaces of gold and cities of stone somewhere beyond the horizon. He dips his quill and begins to draw. Europe is clear. So is Africa mostly. But once he crosses the Ural Mountains, the lines begin to blur. His hand hesitates. What lies beyond? He's never been there. No one he trusts has either. So he fills the void the way humans always do. He imagines. He writes Tartaria in sprawling letters across the page, large enough to cover thousands of miles, because what else can you do when you're staring into the unknown? For Europeans, Tartary became a convenient label, an umbrella term for everything east of civilization and west of comprehension. It wasn't a nation, it was a category, a way to point at a map and say, this belongs to the others. But here's the funny thing. The more they tried to define it, the more mysterious it became. In the 13th century, when the Mongols exploded across Eurasia like a thunderstorm, Europe finally came face to face with the so-called Tartars. Villages burned, kingdoms crumbled, and word of unstoppable horsemen spread faster than the riders themselves. To a continent already steeped in superstition, it must have felt like the end of the world. Priests whispered that the horsemen were the scourge of God, a punishment for human sin. Chroniclers described them as monsters with faces of beasts and hearts of iron. And yet, when the first diplomatic envoys actually met them, they found something unexpected: organization, bureaucracy, even tolerance. The Mongol Empire, at its height, ran on order, not chaos. Messengers carried official seals, merchants moved safely under Mongol protection, and conquered cities often kept their own rulers so long as they paid tribute. The great Khans weren't savages, they were administrators. Ruthless ones, sure, but methodical. But Europe didn't want to believe that. It was easier, somehow, to imagine an empire of shadows, to turn complexity into myth. So the name Tartary stuck, not as a real place, but as a kind of warning, a whispered reminder that beyond the edge of the familiar world, something vast and unknowable waited. By the Renaissance, the legend of Tartary had evolved into something even stranger. The age of exploration brought better maps, but not necessarily better understanding. Cartographers began drawing Great Tartary, Little Tartary, and Chinese Tartary across their globes, carving up Central Asia into neat territories that existed mostly in imagination. If you were a European scholar in 1700 and you saw a map of Great Tartary stretching from Siberia to the Caspian Sea, you'd assume there was a single civilization there, a mighty hidden empire rivaling Rome or China. And if you were an explorer wandering through empty steppes, stumbling across crumbling ruins or strange earthen mounds, your mind might start to fill in the blanks. Who built this? Where did they go? Humans hate loose ends. We crave narrative closure, and Tartary, this vast echoing blank on the map, offered none. Marco Polo didn't help either. His travels fed the fire beautifully. He spoke of vast courts, cities paved in stone, golden palaces, and khans who ruled lands so wide that weeks of riding couldn't cross them. He wasn't wrong exactly. The Mongol Empire really was that enormous. But when his book was copied, translated, and retold, his words grew elastic. People read his tales and imagined something grander still, a civilization older than memory, hidden beneath layers of dust and time. You can almost see it, the way myths grow like vines around facts. Even the Enlightenment couldn't kill it. In the 18th century, as Russian explorers pushed eastward into Siberia, they stumbled upon ancient fortifications, strange geometries in the earth, and traces of civilizations long gone. The local tribes spoke of ancestors who built great cities before the snows came. The scholars, baffled, wrote it all down. And back in Europe, those reports fed the imagination once more. By now, Tartary had become more than geography. It was an aesthetic. The word conjured mystery, distance, and faded grandeur. Artists painted sweeping landscapes of icy mountains and lone riders beneath silver skies. Novelists filled their pages with lost kingdoms and forgotten dynasties. And so, when conspiracy theories about a lost Tartarian Empire began resurfacing centuries later, it wasn't from nowhere. It was born of something older, a long European tradition of misunderstanding the East, of romanticizing what couldn't be explained, and of filling blank spaces with dreams. Maps, after all, are never neutral. They don't just show where things are, they show what people believe matters. And for centuries, Tartary mattered not because it was real, but because it was mysterious. Imagine yourself once more looking at one of those old maps. The parchment crackles under your fingers. The ink has faded to brown. The edges are frayed. Across the top, in flowing letters, are the words, Magna Tartaria. You trace the line of mountains, the curving rivers, the scattered cities whose names you don't recognize. You realize you're staring not at geography, but at imagination, a dream caught in ink, a memory of a place that never quite existed, but that never fully went away either. And maybe that's why Tartaria still captures people today. It wasn't born in a lab or on a message board. It was born in candlelight on parchment, in the minds of men who couldn't stand not knowing. A story that began as cartography became mythology. And mythology, as history always proves, has a way of outlasting the truth. Picture a road that isn't really a road. It's not marked by signs or asphalt or tidy lines of direction. Instead, it's an invisible web of paths, camel tracks winding through dunes, mountain passes marked by cairns, river barges drifting under starlight. This was the Silk Road, not one road, but thousands, threading together China, Persia, India, Byzantium, and everything in between. And somewhere in the middle of that vast tangle lay the ghost of Tartary. The Silk Road was less about silk than it was about exchange. Of goods, yes, but also of ideas, stories, and beliefs. Every caravan that set out carried more than fabric and spices. It carried imagination. The West dreamed of the East as a place of wonder, while the East saw the West as a land of restless curiosity. And where those two imaginations met, right there, In the open steppes of Central Asia, the myth of Tartary quietly took root. Imagine the rhythm of a caravan, bells jingling from camel necks, dust swirling beneath hooves, a merchant humming softly, half to himself, half to keep his pace. At night, when the fires burned low, stories flowed like wine, tales of lost cities swallowed by sand, temples of gold hidden in the desert, empires that rose and vanished before the next dawn. Every traveler added a new layer to the legend, and the Silk Road became less a trade route than a whispering gallery of the world's dreams. Now let's be clear, there were empires here, real ones. The Scythians, Parthians, Sogdians, Kushans, and of course the Mongols, civilizations that thrived for centuries, building fortresses, minting coins, and carving art that fused Greek realism with Persian geometry and Indian grace. These were the real architects of what Europe would later call Tartary. But to a traveler passing through, the borders blurred. One city's language faded into another's. One god's statue looked suspiciously like a god from somewhere else. The world felt unified and strange all at once. The Silk Road had a way of softening distinctions. It made neighbors of distant worlds. Greek philosophers' ideas found their way into Buddhist monasteries. Chinese silk wrapped Roman senators. Persian astronomers charted the same stars that guided caravans across the steppe. But myths travel even faster than silk. When a merchant from Samarkand sold a roll of fabric in Venice, he didn't just trade goods, he traded worlds. He told stories of the East so dazzling they didn't sound real. Cities with towers of glass, he might say, rivers that shimmer like silver. Men who lived 200 years, and back home, when he unpacked his profits and poured himself a drink, he probably heard equally absurd stories about the West. It's easy to forget that for most of human history, distance was a form of magic. The farther away something was, the more fantastical it became. And no distance loomed larger in the European mind than that mysterious space labeled Tartary. Through this swirling exchange, Tartary became a kind of mythic glue, a word that held together the fragments of a world too vast to comprehend. Think of it like this. When a Venetian mapmaker in 1500 scribbled Tartaria across the center of his globe, he wasn't really describing a political entity. He was describing everything between Europe and China, between knowledge and ignorance, between history and imagination. And here's where things get interesting. While Europe imagined Tartary as an exotic wilderness, the people who actually lived there were building connections that shaped the ancient world. The Sogdians, for instance, traders from what's now Uzbekistan, ran a network of trade colonies so extensive that historians sometimes call them the FedEx of the Silk Road. They spoke multiple languages, mediated between empires, and filled their homes with art from every culture they touched. A single Sogdian mural might show an Indian goddess, a Persian king, and a Chinese dragon all sharing the same painted wall. To them, Tartary wasn't a mystery, it was home. And yet, this multicultural world also sowed the seeds for misunderstanding. When distant observers caught glimpses of it, they didn't see the nuances. They saw only the grandeur, the temples, the stone roads, the fortified cities, and assumed it must belong to a single empire. That assumption, multiplied over centuries, became the illusion of the great Tartarian civilization. Even today, the ruins scattered across Central Asia, stone walls buried in sand, intricate tile work crumbling in forgotten courtyards, feed that same longing. People look at them and wonder, who built this? Where did they go? Why do our textbooks skip over it? It's a fair question, because history doesn't just forget, it edits. When empires fall, so do their names. When borders shift, so does memory. The Mongols became the Tatars. The Tatars became Tartars. And eventually, Tartary became a convenient shorthand for the unknown. But beneath all that confusion was something real. A network of humanity that spanned continents. Imagine standing on a hill somewhere near Bukhara around the 10th century. The air smells of dry sage and smoke. Below you, the road shimmers in the heat, lines of travelers winding toward the horizon. A caravan from China passes one from Persia. A monk from India shares a meal with a soldier from Byzantium. Coins from Rome jingle beside jade amulets from the East. It's not an empire. It's not chaos. It's something in between, a living, breathing web of connection. And that's what Tartaria really was, not a kingdom lost to mud, but an echo of this interconnected world, a dream of unity before maps divided it into pieces. The Silk Road gave birth to the myth by accident, because connection always looks like magic when seen from afar. So when modern believers look at old maps and see the word Tartaria sprawled across half the world, maybe they're not completely wrong to feel awe. They're just reading a poem that was once mistaken for a border. The Silk Road blurred the lines between civilization and myth, empire and echo. And in that blur, half dust, half starlight, the legend of Tartaria found its heartbeat. Words have a funny way of sticking to things they were never meant to describe. Tartary was one of those words, an intellectual shortcut that turned into a centuries-long misunderstanding. By the time Europe stumbled out of the medieval era, the East was less a place and more a story. Monks copied maps showing vast lands labeled Tartaria, shaded in pale yellows and browns, with scribbled notes like, "Here be dragons," or "Land of Giants." It wasn't meant as insult or precision. It was just ignorance wrapped in ink. But ignorance dressed up nicely enough can look like authority. When Marco Polo returned from his travels in the late 1200s, he told Europe about the magnificence of the Mongol Empire. Golden palaces, porcelain cities, and roads so smooth you could roll a wagon for days without breaking an axle. His descriptions, half wonder, half exaggeration, lit up Europe's imagination. And when cartographers began to draw what he described, they needed labels. Cathay for China, Ind for India, and for everything else in the vast cold space north of Persia and east of Russia, Tartary. Let's be clear, Europe didn't know what Tartary was, but that didn't stop them from acting like they did. To Western minds, Tartary became a convenient placeholder for the unknown. It wasn't a country, it was a concept, a blank canvas where explorers, missionaries, and chroniclers could project whatever they needed to believe about the world beyond their reach, and what they needed, more often than not, was mystery. Maps from the 16th and 17th centuries show it sprawling across the top of the world like a sleeping giant. Great Tartary, Independent Tartary, Chinese Tartary, Little Tartary, names multiplying like rumors. To anyone who studied those maps, the message was clear. Beyond the borders of civilization lay a vast land of danger, wealth, and the unknown. And there's something deeply human about that. When faced with uncertainty, we name it. We box it in with words, even if those words are wrong. To Europeans of the early modern world, Tartary became shorthand for all the places they hadn't yet conquered, understood, or categorized. It was an intellectual convenience, a linguistic shrug. Everything out there. If If you were a 17th century scholar in London and someone mentioned the Tartars, you might imagine fur hats, horsemen, frozen tundra, and endless plains. You wouldn't know the difference between a Mongol prince in Karakorum and a nomad in the Kazakh steppe. To you, it was all Tartary, but that flattening, reducing countless cultures into a single word, had consequences. It erased identities, histories, and languages in the Western imagination long before any empire actually reached those lands. Imagine an atlas from the 1700s, lying open on a polished oak table. The continents are familiar enough now. The Americas are roughly shaped. Africa's coasts are charted. But look at Asia, and you'll see something odd. Above India and China stretches an ocean of blankness, punctuated only by the word Tartaria, scrawled in proud, swirling letters. No cities marked, no rivers traced, just emptiness. That emptiness became an invitation. Missionaries imagined lost Christian kingdoms hidden in those plains, descended from the mythical Prester John. Explorers fantasized about tribes of giants or entire cities of gold. Poets and philosophers romanticized the steppe as a land of freedom, wild, untamed, untouched by decadence. And over time, that fantasy hardened into pseudo-history. Tartary wasn't just a blank spot anymore, it was a world view. Even the word itself carried a sting. Derived from Tatar, it got twisted into Tartar, echoing the Greek Tartarus, the underworld. Early chroniclers saw the Mongols storm into Europe in the 13th century and thought, "Ah, yes, these must be the people from hell." The name stuck, and for centuries afterward, Tartar became synonymous with savagery, chaos, and apocalypse. When the Mongol Empire fractured and faded, the word didn't fade with it. It lingered. Europe kept calling the steppe Tartary, even as local empires rose and fell. The Golden Horde, the Timurids, the Kazakh Khanates. To the west, these nuances didn't matter. The name Tartary swallowed them whole. The irony. By the time Europe started mapping Tartary with any real accuracy in the 18th and 19th centuries, it had already become a relic. Russia had expanded eastward, swallowing Siberia province by province. Qing China had claimed the west, and yet the word persisted, echoing in atlases long after it had lost any real meaning. There's something almost poetic about that. How a word can outlive the thing it never actually described. And it's here that the modern myth of Tartaria quietly germinated, because when those old maps resurfaced centuries later, digitized, color-corrected, and posted online, they seemed to show something uncanny. A vast empire covering half the world, cities we've never heard of. Borders that no modern historian could explain. To the curious eye, it looked less like a cartographic mistake and more like a cover-up. Why don't they teach this in school? People asked. How could such a massive empire just vanish? But the answer, as with most things, is simpler and somehow more mysterious. It didn't vanish. It never existed. Not as one empire, anyway. What vanished was understanding. What collapsed was the web of meaning connecting the real places, Siberia, Mongolia, Central Asia, to the word Tartary. The West's misunderstanding created a ghost, and the modern age brought that ghost back to life. There's an eerie beauty in that, a reminder that myths don't die. They just wait for technology to resurrect them. When you look at one of those antique maps, ink faded to sepia, the parchment curled at the edges, you can almost feel the hum of it, not as evidence of a conspiracy, but as a fossil of imagination. Tartary wasn't a lie. It was a mirror. It reflected Europe's fears, desires, and limits. And like all mirrors, the longer you stare into it, the more it stares back. By the dawn of the 18th century, the old mystery of Tartary was about to meet its slow death, not in battle, not in flames, but in bureaucracy, in borders drawn, treaties signed, and maps updated by men who preferred paperwork to poetry. It wasn't an erasure in the way myths like to imagine. No secret cataclysm, no forbidden knowledge sealed away by shadowy elites. It was something quieter, more mundane, and somehow more tragic. Tartary was about to be swallowed, not by time, but by empire. Let's set the stage. The year is 1721. Peter the Great has just declared the Russian Empire. He's reformed the army, modernized the navy, shaved the beards off his nobles, and built a brand new capital, St. Petersburg, on a swamp that would one day gleam like a mirror of Europe itself. Russia, once the frontier of the old Tartarian wilderness, now saw itself as its conqueror. And conquest, as Peter understood, was as much about naming as it was about fighting. Where the maps once said Tartaria, Russia began writing Siberia, Yakutsk, Omsk, Irkutsk. The empty spaces of imagination were replaced with administrative precision, governors, garrisons, and census records. You can almost hear the scratching of quills replacing the crack of hooves across the steppe. This was empire by cartography. For centuries, Europe had peered east and seen a void. Russia filled it with coordinates. And just like that, the last breaths of Grand Tartary disappeared under layers of ink and decree. But here's the irony. While the West's maps were losing their mystery, the lands themselves were as unknowable as ever. Siberia wasn't tamed. It was endured. Frozen rivers, taiga forests, mountains that chewed up expeditions and spat them out as legends. To the empire, it was a treasure chest of resources, furs, minerals, and later oil. But to the people living there, it was home. The native tribes, the Evenki, Buryats, Yakuts, and dozens more, didn't think of themselves as Tartarians or Russians. They were simply themselves, and yet, in the tidy world of European cartographers, they became footnotes to someone else's empire. Take a moment to picture a Russian expedition in the mid-17th century, trudging through snow so bright it hurts to look at. The air burns the lungs, the dogs pant steam. A Cossack officer marks a new river on a map, proud that he's bringing civilization to the wilderness. But behind him, an old shaman watches silently, knowing that the land doesn't belong to anyone who needs to draw it to believe it's real. That's how Tartary truly vanished, not by disaster, but by documentation. The Enlightenment had arrived, and mystery was no longer fashionable. The world had to be measured, categorized, and explained. A single romantic name like Tartaria didn't fit into that neat little system. It was too vague, too mythic, too medieval. By the early 19th century, Tartary lingered only as a kind of ghost word on maps, an anachronism that survived in outdated atlases or in the minds of travelers who still preferred fantasy to geography. You might find Chinese Tartary scribbled across what is now Xinjiang, or independent Tartary hovering somewhere over Kazakhstan, but it was already fading, the ink almost apologetic. What had once stretched across half the known world was reduced to a linguistic relic, an old world word for a world that no longer existed. But this quiet death of Tartary created a strange paradox. By removing the name, the empires of the 18th and 19th centuries thought they were clarifying history. In truth, they erased a mystery so thoroughly that, centuries later, people would come looking for it again, because that's the thing about erasure, it always leaves an outline. In the modern age, when digital archaeologists started poring over antique maps, The rediscovery of Tartaria didn't feel like uncovering a lie. It felt like uncovering a secret. Here was proof, they thought, that something immense had once existed and been scrubbed from the record. The irony? They weren't wrong about the erasure. They were just wrong about what was erased. It wasn't a hidden utopia or an advanced global empire. What disappeared was ambiguity itself, the willingness to admit we didn't know everything. The 18th century push for rational order, scientific mapping, and imperial control smoothed the rough edges of the world, and in doing so, it flattened mystery into history. Let's be clear, the loss of Tartary wasn't a conspiracy. It was a side effect of certainty, and maybe that's why its ghost haunts us still, because deep down humans don't actually like a world that's too explained. We crave wonder, we miss the blank spaces, so when we see Tartaria glowing faintly on an old parchment, we don't just see a name, we see a question. A whisper from the past asking, "What did you forget?" The collapse of Tartary wasn't a fall. It was a fade-out, a slow dimming of a word that once carried the vastness of the unknown, and the quieter it got, the louder the myth became. By the time Russia completed its imperial expansion across Asia, by the time the British, French, and Qing empires carved their pieces of the East, Tartary had been buried not under mud, but under maps. And centuries later, when people began brushing that dust away, what they found wasn't evidence of a lost civilization. It was evidence of our collective imagination still alive and searching. That is the strange beauty of this myth. Tartaria may never have been real in the way empires are real, but its death, its quiet bureaucratic burial, feels as monumental as any fall of Rome, because sometimes the end of mystery is its own kind of catastrophe. Chapter 3. The Great Erasure. Lost knowledge, world fairs, and the architecture of amnesia. Take a deep breath. We're leaving behind the dust of the steppe and stepping into marble, into the gaslit glow of the 19th century, because this is where the story of Tartaria is reborn. Not in Siberia, not on the maps, but in the imagination. Picture it. The year is 1893. The World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. 200 white buildings rise like mirages along the lake, glowing in electric light. Domes, arches, columns, architecture so grand that people literally wept when they saw it. It looked ancient, impossible, like something from a forgotten golden age resurrected overnight. And here's the kicker. It was built overnight. A team of architects and laborers had thrown up that entire city in less than 2 years. They called it the White City. To the public, it was a triumph of modernity, but to later eyes it looked suspiciously like something else. Massive domed palaces, ornate fountains, obelisks, colonnades stretching into mist. It looked ancient, yes, but not Greek, not Roman. It looked out of time. Now fast forward a century. A man sitting at his computer zooms in on old photos of the fair. He pauses. He notices something strange. The buildings look far too advanced for their time, he thinks. Too perfect, too grand. And then he finds something even stranger. After the fair ended, almost every single building was demolished, burned, scrapped, gone. And that's how a new kind of myth was born. The idea that maybe, just maybe, these temporary structures weren't built at all, at least not by us. Maybe they were rediscovered, remnants of an older, erased civilization. A civilization called Tartaria. Let's be clear, the buildings were real. We have blueprints, records, payrolls, receipts for every brick. But the feeling, the awe they inspired, the eerie way they appeared and vanished, felt mythic. It tapped into something ancient in the human psyche. our suspicion that we've forgotten something big. And once that suspicion took root, it spread. Soon people began noticing Tartarian architecture everywhere. Those impossible domes in St. Petersburg, the Capitol building in Washington, the palace-like train stations of Paris, even the city halls of small American towns. Weren't they all too ornate, too advanced for their supposed era? The theory blossomed like ivy over ruins that maybe the 1800s weren't a time of invention, but of cover-up, that there had been a worldwide reset, a mud flood, a cataclysm that wiped out the old civilization and left humanity to rebuild amid the ruins. The world's fairs, in this view, weren't celebrations of modern progress at all. They were redecorations, a way to reintroduce a repurposed world, scrubbed clean of its true history. The fairs, the grand expos, were merely the unveiling ceremonies of a planet repainted. Now this is where skepticism and wonder collide, because if you look at those photos, you can feel it. The eerie stillness of early photography only adds to the illusion. Long exposures make crowds disappear. The buildings stand pristine, gleaming, deserted, as if waiting for a civilization that never returned. It's beautiful and unsettling and hypnotic. Even historians, with all their explanations, temporary plaster facades, neoclassical revival trends, technological optimism, can't quite dispel the dreamlike quality. It's too pretty, too deliberate. It feels like memory, not progress. And that's what makes the Tartaria myth so powerful. It didn't come from ignorance, it came from longing. Because by the 19th century, humanity had built machines that could fly, factories that could blot out the sun, and cities that swallowed nature whole. We had replaced mystery with machinery, but beneath the gears and soot, people were starting to feel something hollow, something missing. Tartaria filled that hole. It became the name for everything that seemed too beautiful, too harmonious, too purposeful to belong to the chaotic modern world. It was nostalgia in disguise, a yearning for an imagined time when architecture was sacred, when energy was free, when civilization felt like art rather than industry. Of course, the irony is exquisite. The people of the 19th century built those palaces themselves, but we, centuries later, look back and refuse to believe them capable. Maybe it's easier to believe in a lost utopia than in the idea that our ancestors simply cared more about beauty than we do. So imagine walking through that white city. The lamps hum softly. The canal reflects the moonlight. Music drifts from the pavilions. You hear the shuffle of dresses, the murmur of voices, the click of carriage wheels, and for a moment you can almost believe the myth that you've stumbled into the remains of a vanished empire, briefly resurrected for one last dance before fading again into legend. That's the strange charm of Tartaria. It doesn't matter if it's real. What matters is how it makes you feel, because beneath every conspiracy is a heartbeat, the desire to belong to something greater, to touch a truth the textbooks forgot to mention. And so, through the flickering gaslights of the 19th century, the dream of Tartaria returned, not in stone, but in spirit, not as an empire rediscovered, but as a memory resurrected. Let's be honest for a moment. Modern architecture doesn't exactly make the heart sing. Steel boxes, glass towers, angles sharp enough to injure your soul. Function over form, they say. Minimalism, efficiency, progress. But walk past an old courthouse or a crumbling railway station with columns carved like Roman temples, and suddenly something stirs. It feels like memory. Not your memory, but someone's. And that's exactly where Tartaria hides, in that emotional shadow between nostalgia and doubt. See, the 19th century didn't just give us new machines, it gave us new eyes. Photography froze the world for the first time. Urbanization made old beauty vanish beneath brick and smog. And as the industrial age thundered forward, the West began quietly rewriting itself, paving over not just landscapes, but the very story of civilization. This was the age of erasure disguised as progress. When old cathedrals were restored into shapes they had never been, when ancient city walls were torn down to make room for the future, when soot-blackened monuments were scrubbed and renamed, their histories conveniently rewritten for the age of reason. Historians call it modernization. Tartaria believers call it cover-up. Now, let's pause and take a breath, because this is where myth and history start blending like watercolor. The truth is simpler, but also sadder. It wasn't a conspiracy, it was forgetfulness. The 1800s were obsessed with the new: steam, glass, iron, materials that seemed to promise immortality. The faster technology advanced, the more the past looked like an inconvenience. When people demolished centuries-old buildings to make room for factories or boulevards, they didn't think they were erasing history. They thought they were improving it. But here's the paradox. Progress, when it moves fast enough, feels like amnesia. Imagine being a farmer's son in 1820, living in a cottage built by your grandfather, heated by the same hearth. Then picture your grandson in 1890, born under electric light, surrounded by locomotives, reading newspapers printed on machines that could churn out 1 million copies before breakfast. The pace of change was dizzying. The world your ancestors knew had disappeared before your own eyes. And when memory fades that quickly, even the truth starts to look like myth. That's why the great buildings of the 19th century seem suspicious to us now. They're too perfect, too ambitious, too permanent in an age obsessed with speed. To modern eyes, they feel like artifacts of a lost age, something inherited, not made. The Tartaria theory, in this sense, is less about deceit and more about disbelief. We don't believe we could have built something so beautiful in such a short span of time. And perhaps we're right, but not in the way we think, because that beauty came at a cost. It came from child labor, industrial soot, and the quiet suffering of millions who laid bricks, carved columns, and forged iron in furnaces hotter than the sun. It came from colonial wealth siphoned from distant lands. The marble glimmered, yes, but it glimmered on the backs of the exhausted. So when modern minds gaze at that architecture and whisper, "This can't be human," they're half right. It wasn't built by ordinary humanity. It was built by empire. But myths rarely linger on exploitation. They linger on wonder. That's what gives the Tartaria myth its endurance. It erases guilt and replaces it with awe. Instead of confronting how we gained that grandeur, we imagine inheriting it from some ancient, harmonious civilization. A world without conquest, without industry, without soot. A world that built for beauty's sake alone. That's the secret comfort of believing in Tartaria. It allows us to dream of innocence without the blood, to long for sophistication without the cost. And it's not entirely foolish, because beauty is suspicious in the modern world. Think about it. When was the last time a new building made you stop and gasp? When was the last time a city skyline felt like poetry instead of spreadsheet logic? We live in an age that worships utility and scoffs at ornament. So when people look at those domed cathedrals, those train stations like palaces, those impossible star forts etched into the earth, they don't just see architecture, they see meaning, they see intention. And maybe that's what we've lost, the sense that building could be an act of reverence. The Tartarian lens turns architecture into scripture. It whispers that every arch, every dome, every hidden basement tells a story too big to fit inside textbooks. And whether that story is real or imagined, it soothes a modern ache, the feeling that progress has traded wonder for efficiency. So next time you see an old photo of St. Petersburg shrouded in snow or San Francisco's City Hall gleaming in filtered sunlight, look closer, forget the dates, forget the facts, and just feel it. The silence, the symmetry, the faint pulse of something grander than logic. That's the hum Tartaria leaves behind. The ghost frequency of a civilization that may never have existed, but still haunts us with the possibility that it did. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the myth survives not because it's true, but because it's beautiful. Because deep down, beauty itself has started to feel like a conspiracy. Here's the funny thing about lost civilizations. They always seem to resurface when technology changes. The printing press revived Atlantis, television revived the pyramids, and the internet, well, the internet resurrected Tartaria, not in dusty libraries or archaeological digs, but in image boards, YouTube videos, Reddit threads, and algorithm-fed rabbit holes that feel half like history class and half like lucid dream. If the 19th century erased memory through progress, then the 21st century resurrected it through curiosity. The internet, for all its chaos, gave the world a second archive, a place where forgotten photographs, misfiled maps, and half-remembered myths could find each other again. And that's where Tartaria thrived, among digital ruins. Let's be clear, no mainstream historian believes in the Tartarian Empire, but belief doesn't need credentials, it needs emotion. And online, emotion spreads faster than evidence. It starts small. Someone scrolling through antique photos finds an image of a half-buried building, its windows strangely below street level. They post it with a caption, "Mud flood? Hidden history?" Someone else comments with an old map labeled Great Tartary, stretching across half of Asia. Another user adds photos of star forts, geometric fortifications shaped like mandalas carved into the earth. Then someone else notices that the architecture of 19th century world fairs, domes, spires, impossibly ornate facades, seems eerily similar across continents. And suddenly, the pattern takes on life. A civilization that might never have existed begins to coalesce, not in ruins, but in pixels. It's fascinating to watch. The modern Tartarian myth isn't a single story. It's an ecosystem, a living organism built out of collective imagination. People piece together images, compare architectural styles, track supposed mud flood layers in Google Earth, and speculate about ancient technology, free energy, and global resets. And let's be honest, there's something soothing about it. It scratches the same itch that makes people organize puzzle pieces at 2 a.m. You start with fragments, photographs, engravings, forgotten buildings, and try to make sense of the world's dissonance. Why does history sometimes feel incomplete? Why do our cities seem to rest on older bones? Why does beauty feel borrowed? The Tartaria theory online isn't just conspiracy, it's therapy for disillusionment. See, we live in an age drowning in data, but starving for coherence. Billions of facts, timelines, and explanations float around like loose screws. But the more we learn, the less it feels like we understand. We've traded mystery for information, and somehow that doesn't feel like progress. Tartaria brings the mystery back. Scroll through its digital cathedrals, YouTube thumbnails of glowing domes and forgotten maps, and you'll see that what people crave isn't deception, it's wonder. the feeling that history still holds secrets, that maybe we haven't already found every answer, that maybe, just maybe, there's still magic left under the mud. And the internet, for all its cynicism, feeds that craving beautifully. Where old historians dismissed oddities as coincidences, the online world stitches them together with creativity. Star forts become energy hubs, domes become ancient power stations, mud floods become symbolic of global resets, metaphors for forgotten knowledge buried under modern noise. It's easy to laugh, but maybe we shouldn't, because behind every pixelated claim is something deeply human, the refusal to accept a world without mystery. The same impulse that made explorers sail off the map now makes people scroll through archives at 3 a.m, chasing the ghost of a civilization that never left a skeleton behind. And there's something else, an aesthetic truth. Look at those old photos, the sepia skies, the faint haze, the impossible scale of those buildings. They feel dreamlike, like glimpses from another timeline where humanity built for eternity instead of quarterly profits. When people online say, "This architecture is too perfect to be from our timeline," what they're really saying is, "This feels like a dream I half remember." And that's what Tartaria has become, a collective dream stitched together from the past's photographs and the future's loneliness. Of course, the irony is delicious. The very technology that gave us infinite knowledge also gave us infinite uncertainty. The more we digitized our history, the more unreal it began to look. Old black and white photos uploaded at high resolution don't make history clearer. They make it stranger. The lighting, the shadows, the absence of movement, it all feels frozen, ghostly, like the world before electricity was somehow more alive. So when you see someone online connecting old city photos and whispering Tartaria, what you're witnessing isn't delusion, it's longing, a search for coherence, for the feeling that history isn't just progress and decay, but a cycle of remembering and forgetting. And isn't that what all civilizations do? They rise, they crumble, and then they return in imagination. Rome, Atlantis, Lemuria, Tartaria, each one a mirror reflecting not the past, but our hunger to belong to something grander than the present. In that sense, the internet didn't invent Tartaria, it simply gave it a voice, a new empire of whispers sprawling across servers and screens, where myths are immortal and disbelief is optional. Scroll long enough and you'll start to see why people stay. The posts feel soothingly repetitive. Arches, domes, star forts, mud floods, each image a little lullaby of lost grandeur. A bedtime story told by algorithms instead of grandfather. So maybe Tartaria isn't a place at all. Maybe it's what happens when memory and imagination meet in the glow of a computer screen. Half fact, half wish. The myth doesn't just say, "Look what we've lost." It says, "Look what we still want to believe." And that, perhaps, is the most human story of all. Let's pause for a moment, take a slow breath, and think about why people believe in things like Tartaria. Not in the mocking way you see on forums or documentaries, but really think about it. Why does the idea of a lost civilization hidden under our cities feel comforting? It's not stupidity, it's not gullibility, it's yearning. Humans, for all our cleverness, are wired for mystery. We're pattern-seeking animals, tracing meaning in the stars, in tea leaves, in the cracks of old maps. The unknown makes us restless, the known makes us bored, and between the two we spin myths that make life feel a little more meaningful. Tartaria lives in that space. It's not really about mud floods or star forts. It's about the suspicion, deep down, that the world we've been handed is incomplete, that someone, somewhere, has hidden something important, that maybe history isn't a straight line of progress, but a looping dream where civilizations rise, fall, and are forgotten not by accident, but by design. And honestly, that's not such a crazy thought. Think about how much of history you've forgotten personally. Think of everything humanity has lost to fire, war, vanity, or neglect. Libraries burned, languages erased, empires swallowed by desert and jungle. The dark ages weren't dark because nothing happened. They're dark because the light of memory didn't reach that far. So when someone looks at an ornate 19th century building and says, "I don't think we built that," they're not rejecting history. They're mourning it. They're mourning a world that seems to have misplaced its wonder. Let's be clear, modern life doesn't give us much mystery anymore. We have answers for everything, or at least the illusion of them. You can type any question into a search bar and get a dozen replies in seconds. But that convenience has a side effect. It kills the thrill of not knowing. And mystery, as it turns out, is essential to the human spirit. Without it, the world feels flat. That's where conspiracies slip in. They fill the void left by lost awe. When people say the elites hid the truth of Tartaria, what they're really saying is, I miss when the world felt magical. It's an emotional rebellion against boredom, a soft protest against a sterile universe made of facts but lacking enchantment. And here's the interesting part, it's not new. Every age invents its lost golden age. The Greeks dreamed of Atlantis. The Victorians romanticized Lemuria. The 20th century turned the Mayans into cosmic prophets. And now, in the digital age, we have Tartaria, an empire of dreams built on archives and algorithms. Each generation looks backward and imagines perfection because it's easier than imagining perfection ahead. We do it because the past is safe. It can't disappoint us anymore. Psychologically, belief in a hidden civilization like Tartaria scratches multiple itches at once. There's pattern recognition, the brain's love for connecting dots even when they don't belong together. There's narrative control, the soothing illusion that the world makes sense, that nothing happens by accident. And there's nostalgia, the bittersweet ache for a world that may never have existed, but should have. And then there's trust. Modern institutions, media, government, academia, have lost credibility with the public. When experts say, that's impossible, a growing part of the population quietly replies, so was flight once. The more closed and dismissive authority becomes, the more open people become to alternative voices whispering, maybe they're hiding something. It's not that people trust random YouTube channels more than historians. It's that the channels sound human, curious, skeptical, fallible. The voice of official history often sounds cold, certain, and patronizing. The voice of the Tartaria believer sounds like someone sitting beside you late at night saying, "Look at this, doesn't it make you wonder?" And wonder is addictive. Once you feel it, it's hard to go back to plain explanations. Even the act of believing, of piecing clues together, creates a small dopamine rush. It gives the believer a sense of purpose. You're not just scrolling, you're investigating. You're part of something big, something secret. It's empowering in a world that makes most people feel small and powerless. So the Tartarian myth becomes more than a theory. It becomes a community, a shared dream. People trade discoveries, maps, and theories not because they're delusional, but because it feels good to search together. The hunt becomes the reward, and in that sense, Tartaria isn't a symptom of ignorance. It's a symptom of loneliness. Think about it. The more connected we are online, the less connected we feel in real life. Cities are crowded but isolating. News is constant but disorienting. Our modern world gives us everything except belonging. And so, people build belonging out of mystery. Believing in a hidden past means believing in meaning itself, that we're not just floating through chaos, that someone somewhere once built something extraordinary, and maybe we can again. That's not conspiracy. That's hope in disguise. Of course, hope can be dangerous when it turns to dogma, when questioning becomes obsession, when imagination becomes paranoia. That's when the myth begins to rot, when every gap in knowledge becomes a plot, and every historian becomes an enemy. That's when wonder collapses into fear. But before that point, before the cynicism sets in, there's something oddly beautiful about it. People standing in awe before old cathedrals and asking, how did they do it? People digging through archives at midnight, convinced that history still has secrets. It's easy to mock that. Harder to admit that it's the same impulse that built science, art, and philosophy in the first place. Curiosity is the ember. Myth is just the smoke. So the Tartarian believers, in a strange way, are modern heirs to the ancient dreamers, the ones who stared at the stars and saw gods, the ones who saw order in chaos. They're not historians, but they are human. They want the past to matter. They want the present to make sense. And maybe that's why Tartaria lingers. Not because it's real, but because it feels right, in some deep, poetic way that logic can't quite dismantle. It tells a story not about what we've found, but what we've lost. And that's a kind of truth, too. As the night deepens, imagine those endless digital threads, thousands of people across time zones, glowing screens reflecting in tired eyes, all dreaming together of a civilization that never was. Maybe they aren't crazy. Maybe they're just homesick for a world that once felt full of wonder. Let's take a breath here. After all this talk of vanished empires and buried cities, it's time to do what the best historians always do. Look carefully, quietly, and without agenda. Because when you set aside the noise of the internet and really look at what's left of Tartaria, what you find isn't a conspiracy. It's something far more human, and somehow even more fascinating. The term Tartary was not a secret code name for a lost empire. It was a geographic placeholder, a cartographer's shrug. For centuries, Europeans simply didn't know what lay beyond the Ural Mountains or deep in the Siberian steppe. So they wrote Tartaria, like writing "Here be dragons," a kind of verbal fog to fill the blanks. The maps weren't evidence of an empire erased. They were evidence of ignorance being slowly replaced by exploration. And those grand old buildings, the ones people point to as proof of impossible architecture, they're very possible. Magnificent, yes. Impossible, no. The ornate city halls, cathedrals, and palaces of the 19th century weren't built by some forgotten super-civilization. They were built by humans with chisels, scaffolds, and a near-religious obsession with grandeur. The 1800s were a century drunk on ambition. Industrialization made iron, glass, and concrete cheaper than ever. Colonization and global trade poured wealth into Europe's cities. Architects looked backward to Greece, Rome, Byzantium, and Egypt, and then combined everything like over-enthusiastic chefs. The result was the neoclassical explosion, domes, columns, and marble facades that looked ancient but were brand new. That's why so many people mistake them for relics, because they were designed to look timeless. They were Rome in steel corsets, deliberate nostalgia built in brick and plaster. The world's fairs that fuel so many Tartarian videos, they were real, yes, and they really did look astonishing. Whole temporary cities of palaces, fountains, and gleaming towers that appeared overnight and vanished just as quickly. But they weren't cover-ups. They were theatre. They were the 19th century showing off. Most of those buildings were plaster over wood, not marble. They were meant to impress, not endure. When the fair ended, the facades were torn down or burned, leaving only photographs that today look eerily like the ruins of a forgotten world. No secret empire, just show business. And those famous mud flood buildings with their half-buried windows, they too have ordinary explanations. Cities sink, streets rise, over centuries as populations grow and roads are repaved. Layers of soil and stone accumulate. Old ground floors become basements. It's not mystery, it's maintenance. Yet it's easy to see why the illusion caught fire. Because even the real explanations, erosion, engineering, economics, are, in their own way, beautiful. The world doesn't need hidden magic to be miraculous. Consider this. The same roads once labelled Tartarian carried traders, nomads, poets and conquerors across continents. Cultures met, clashed and blended until identities blurred. What Europe called Tartary was not one empire but a kaleidoscope of peoples, Turkic, Mongol, Persian, Russian, Chinese, each with their own stories, languages and gods. Out of their collisions came ideas, inventions and art that shaped the world we still live in. The myth says Tartaria was erased. The truth is that it was never singular to begin with. It was many, and that's why it's hard to pin down. The steppe doesn't lend itself to borders. Empires there were fluid, waves of power that rolled across the grasslands and receded again. The Scythians, the Huns, the Mongols, the Khazars, they all rose, ruled and vanished, leaving behind only fragments. To an outsider, that flux looked like a void. To those who lived it, it was life itself. And maybe that's where the misunderstanding lies. Western history loves walls and dates, beginnings, endings, dynasties. The steppe doesn't play by those rules. Its empires were seasonal, migratory, woven into the land and wind. If you expect pyramids, you miss the poetry. So no, there was no single global Tartarian empire, but there was a vast interconnected world of trade, culture, and movement that stretched from Europe to China long before globalization had a name. The Silk Road wasn't just silk, it was the internet of its day, transmitting not data but ideas. Buddhism, astronomy, metalwork, medicine all passed through those dusty caravans. The real miracle isn't that something was erased, it's that so much survived, and yet debunking doesn't have to mean disappointment. If anything, it should make the world feel richer, because the truth is not dull, it's layered. The mud flood isn't proof of deception, it's proof of time. The ornate buildings aren't relics of a forgotten empire, they're monuments to human excess. The missing maps aren't evidence of suppression, they're artifacts of discovery. And here's the quiet irony. Even the myth itself is part of history now. The videos, the forums, the believers, they've become a digital folklore, our century's way of myth-making. Future historians might study us and say, they dreamed of Tartaria because they were tired of concrete. Maybe that's what keeps the story alive. Not deceit, but desire. The desire for mystery, beauty, and meaning in an age that feels too catalogued, too explained. Tartaria is less a conspiracy than a collective poem, one line written in frustration, another in wonder. And perhaps that's how we should leave it, gently. The myth and the truth coexisting like twin shadows cast by the same fire. The factual story of history's shifting frontiers, and the emotional story of humanity's hunger for lost splendor. So the next time you pass an old building with buried windows, or stumble across an antique map marked Tartary, don't roll your eyes, And don't fall into the rabbit hole either. Just pause, look, feel the weight of centuries pressing quietly under your feet. Real or imagined, every layer of that soil carries a story. Because whether it's called Rome, Babylon, Atlantis, or Tartaria, the dream of forgotten empires never really fades. It just changes shape, waiting for someone new to wonder. Chapter 4. The Eternal City, Why We Dream of Lost Civilizations. Take a moment, close your eyes, and imagine you're standing in the ruins of a city that never existed. The stones are warm beneath your feet. The air hums faintly with the echo of 1,000 unrecorded stories, and the wind brushes against carved columns whose builders' names were never written down. It's a dream, but somehow it feels truer than waking. That's the strange comfort of Tartaria. Even after we've picked apart the facts, even after the history books have closed the case, the idea lingers. The notion that somewhere, sometime, humanity built something magnificent, a civilization unified, enlightened, and then, inexplicably, erased. It's the same instinct that makes us search for Atlantis, or Lemuria, or the lost library of Alexandria. A quiet yearning that whispers, maybe we used to know more, maybe we were better once. And let's be clear, this isn't foolishness, it's longing. Believing in Tartaria isn't really about maps or mud floods. It's about something deeper, the ache for lost harmony, for order in the chaos of modern life. When we look around at endless screens, broken systems, and cynical politics, it's easy to imagine that somewhere in the past, people had it figured out, that there was a time when beauty and wisdom ruled, before we traded them for convenience. The myth gives that feeling a shape. Tartaria becomes a mirror for what we think we've lost, a golden age we can project our frustrations onto, a fantasy of unity against the fragmentation of the modern world. But here's the curious twist. Myths like Tartaria comfort us because they're out of reach. They can't be disproven in a way that satisfies the heart. The less we know, the more space the imagination has to wander. That's what myths do best. They thrive in the gaps, the shadows between facts. Think about how the story feels, not just what it says. Tartaria isn't told in sharp, factual sentences. It's whispered in forums late at night by people who sound more wistful than conspiratorial. They're not shouting about domination. They're sighing about what might have been. It's not paranoia, it's melancholy. The same kind of melancholy you feel walking through an abandoned building, seeing beauty and decay folded together. There's a paradox at the heart of this comfort. We know modern life is more advanced than any age before it, yet it rarely feels that way. We have the internet, medicine, spaceflight, instant communication, but we also have loneliness, burnout, and an undercurrent of loss. The myth of a vanished civilization fills that emotional void. It says, you're right to feel that something's missing. It's like nostalgia for a memory we never had. And in that sense, Tartaria isn't about the past at all. It's about the present, about how alien our own world can feel. The skyscrapers of glass and steel, the humming servers, the sterile symmetry of cities built for efficiency rather than awe. No wonder people scroll through photos of old domes, arches, and impossible cathedrals and feel something stir. Those buildings look like they remember something we've forgotten, so we call it Tartaria. We give the feeling a name. It's easier to believe there was once an age of grace that was stolen than to accept that beauty is fragile, and we let it slip away ourselves. But this comfort isn't all illusion. The belief itself reveals something profound about us. Humans are meaning-seeking creatures. When the world feels senseless, we create patterns to make it make sense. We weave stories over the noise, and in those stories, we find calm. Myths are our way of telling ourselves that the universe still has order, even if it's hidden. That's why so many people find peace in the idea of a lost civilization. It implies that knowledge, beauty, and balance aren't gone forever, just misplaced. It turns chaos into a temporary condition. And maybe that's why Tartaria caught fire in the digital age. The internet is chaos incarnate, 1,000 overlapping timelines, all screaming for attention. In that noise, the myth feels like a lullaby. It slows everything down. It says, once there was harmony. Once the world was whole. Now, whether that's true or not almost doesn't matter. What matters is the feeling it evokes, the quiet pull towards something larger, wiser, softer than the present. The myth becomes a kind of spiritual balm for an age that measures everything but meaning. Imagine yourself late at night, scrolling through photos of ornate ruins, strange domes, or cities half buried in snow. You feel that twinge, that recognition without memory. The beauty is haunting, not because it hides a secret empire, but because it reminds you that time erases, and yet somehow we still search for permanence. That search, that ache, is what keeps myths alive. They aren't about fooling ourselves. They're about coping, finding wonder again in a world that's forgotten how to dream. And maybe that's the greatest comfort of all. Tartaria might not have existed on a map, but it exists in us, in that quiet place between curiosity and longing, where we still hope that something grand and good once stood before the mud, before the noise, before the forgetting. If you really want to understand why Tartaria has captured so many imaginations, you have to stop asking what it was and start asking what it means. Because myths, like mirrors, don't just reflect the world, they reflect us. When people talk about Tartaria, they're not just discussing lost cities or forgotten empires. They're projecting themselves, their hopes, their doubts, their nostalgia, onto a blank canvas of the past. Tartaria becomes less of a place and more of a personality test for civilization. Think about it. To some, Tartaria represents a golden age of harmony and beauty, proof that humanity once lived in balance with nature and technology. To others, it's evidence of corruption and suppression, a story of truth hidden by elites and rewritten by victors. The same myth, two completely different reflections. It tells you less about history and more about what people want from it. And maybe that's the point. Tartaria isn't history. It's a Rorschach test for modern anxiety. We look into its cloudy waters and see what we most long for, or most fear. Let's be clear, myths don't survive because they're accurate. They survive because they're useful. They give shape to feelings that don't fit neatly into textbooks. They're how we process the gap between the world we have and the one we wish we had. The idea of a lost, enlightened civilization comforts us precisely because it suggests that the world wasn't always this complicated. That maybe, somewhere back in time, people figured out the balance between science and spirituality, between art and function, between progress and peace. And if they could, maybe we can again. That's why you'll notice something poetic in the way Tartaria believers talk. It's not just data or dates, it's reverence. They speak of architecture the way others speak of cathedrals. They trace maps like pilgrimages. They aren't just arguing for history. They're mourning for something sacred. You can see it in the fascination with architecture, the domes, arches, spires, and towers that dot the myth. These buildings feel alive, don't they? Too beautiful to be merely functional, too symmetrical to be accidental. When people say, there's no way we could build this today, what they're really saying is, we don't build like this anymore. We don't fill our world with beauty unless it serves a profit. The myth becomes a critique of our own era, disguised as nostalgia for another. Tartaria, then, is the mirror we hold up to our own cultural amnesia. We scroll through pictures of palaces and fairgrounds, domes and star forts, and we whisper, how did we forget to dream like this? The myth reflects not a lost empire, but a lost aesthetic soul. There's something almost therapeutic about that reflection. Myths like Tartaria allow us to grieve, not for people we've lost, but for possibilities. They let us feel that our yearning for meaning isn't crazy, that maybe it used to exist, that maybe someone, somewhere, built a world that made sense, and maybe that's why Tartaria feels more mystical than menacing. Most conspiracy theories isolate people, make them suspicious of the world. Tartaria, strangely, connects them. It invites wonder instead of fear. It suggests that the past might still hold beauty waiting to be rediscovered. But reflection cuts both ways. Myths also reveal our blind spots. When people claim that all grand architecture must have come from a lost civilization, they sometimes overlook the real genius of the humans who built it. The artisans, masons, and engineers who left their fingerprints in stone. The myth honors beauty, but erases the hands that created it. It's a paradox. In searching for greatness, we forget the greatness already recorded, and maybe that's the truest mirror of all. We live in an age obsessed with rediscovery, yet blind to what's in plain sight. We chase mysteries across continents while ignoring the ones humming beneath our feet. The hidden systems, the forgotten craftsmanship, the quiet brilliance of ordinary people. Tartaria, then, tells us something we don't often admit, that we don't fully trust our own civilization. We sense that something's off, something hollow beneath all the progress. So, we project our doubt backward into the comforting distance of myth. In the reflection of Tartaria, we see ourselves, advanced yet uneasy, connected yet lonely, powerful yet perpetually nostalgic. It's less about whether an empire was erased, and more about whether we've erased our ability to feel awe. Maybe that's why the myth persists. Because deep down, we're not really searching for proof of Tartaria. We're searching for proof that humanity still knows how to build something beautiful and believe in it. And if myths are mirrors, then maybe looking at Tartaria long enough isn't about finding truth in the past, but rediscovering it in the present, in the domes still standing, the dreams still lingering, the stories we keep retelling because they make us feel a little less small. So the next time someone mentions the lost empire, don't argue, just listen, because behind every myth is a whisper of what we wish were real. And sometimes that wish tells you everything you need to know about the people dreaming it. Every empire, no matter how radiant, tells the same quiet story, one of ascent, arrogance, and entropy. Rome, Egypt, the Maya, the Mongols, the British, the Ottomans, and if you believe the whispers, Tartaria. The names change, the rhythm doesn't. Civilizations are like tides. They rise with clarity, crest with confidence, and recede with denial. It's not failure, it's physics. Even stars burn out, and they're made of far sturdier stuff than marble or pride. So maybe that's why Tartaria lingers in our collective imagination, because it fits the pattern too well. A lost empire swallowed by time, a forgotten people erased by cataclysm, a name that once filled maps and now feels like a ghost. It's familiar, almost comforting in its tragedy. Let's be clear though, No empire believes it's the one that's going to fall. Every generation thinks it's special, unique, immune to collapse because it has better technology, more data, smarter systems. But arrogance, like gravity, pulls everything back to Earth. If Tartaria existed, if even a fragment of the legend were real, its disappearance would have followed the same script as every empire's twilight. The small cracks first, corruption, complacency, overreach, then the slow decay disguised as progress, and finally the quiet moment when the last flame flickers out and the world simply moves on. You can almost imagine it, the final days of a grand civilization, not with war or fire, but with exhaustion, merchants still trading, scholars still writing, architects still sketching impossible domes for clients who will never pay. The end doesn't always come with thunder. Sometimes it's a sigh. And here's the thing. We need myths like Tartaria because they remind us that our own civilization isn't exempt. It's a soft warning wrapped in wonder. The idea that maybe, just maybe, we've been here before. Towering cities, vast networks, unshakable certainty, and lost it all to hubris and time. You see, the cycle isn't just historical, it's psychological. We build, we forget, we rebuild. We burn libraries, then mourn the loss of knowledge. We pave over ruins, then spend centuries digging them up again. The pattern is maddeningly human. The Greeks had a term for this, anarchiklosis, the cycle of government and decay. Kingdoms become tyrannies, tyrannies become democracies, democracies collapse back into chaos. Wash, rinse, repeat. The myth of Tartaria just takes that ancient idea and stretches it across a planetary scale. And that's what makes it powerful, because deep down we know the pattern fits us too. Look at the ruins of any civilization, and you'll find the same fingerprints. Ambition, brilliance, greed, denial. The same stone roads leading nowhere. The same monuments built to outlast time, quietly losing that argument. Even today we build our towers of glass and steel, our data empires, our digital libraries with the same optimism that we're preserving knowledge forever. But maybe 1,000 years from now, someone will wander through our abandoned cities and ask the same question we whisper about Tartaria. Who built all this? Maybe that's why we're drawn to stories of collapse told in soft voices, because they allow us to grieve for what's inevitable before it happens. They help us process the strange truth that impermanence is not failure, it's the natural order. In that sense, Tartaria becomes a bedtime story for civilization itself, a reminder that we are temporary but not meaningless, that even in loss there's continuity. The ruins of one world become the foundations of the next. And if you look closely, you'll see that rebirth is always hiding inside decay. The Renaissance bloomed from the ashes of plague. The Enlightenment grew out of dark superstition. Even myths once dismissed are rediscovered as metaphors with new life. The cycle never ends. It only changes costume. So perhaps Tartaria isn't just about a lost civilization, but the eternal rhythm of creation itself. We build worlds, lose them, and then dream them again. Every myth, every ruin, every archive is a heartbeat in that endless pulse. Imagine standing at the edge of some forgotten city, moss creeping over marble, wind sighing through hollow windows, and realizing that this place once thought it was eternal too, that people once stood here, confident that their children's children would never forget their names. But the earth has other plans, and yet the beauty is in the persistence. Even in silence the stones whisper. Even when names fade, the patterns remain. Every fallen empire becomes a lesson written in dust, and every myth like Tartaria is the echo of that lesson, trying to reach us before we make the same mistake. History doesn't repeat exactly, but it rhymes in hauntingly familiar cadences. The trick isn't to break the cycle, it's to learn to hear the rhythm, to build with humility, to remember what was forgotten before, and to leave behind something that, even when buried, still hums with meaning. So when you hear the word Tartaria, don't roll your eyes. Listen to the rhythm beneath it, because that's not just a myth about the past. It's a lullaby for the present, and maybe a warning for the future. There's something irresistible about a mystery that refuses to die. You can debunk it, explain it, trace its origins down to the dusty corners of old libraries, but if it still feels like a secret, people will keep chasing it. That's the real magic of Tartaria. It doesn't survive because it's proven. It survives because it haunts. In a world that measures everything, categorizes everything, and leaves nothing ungoogleable, a mystery like Tartaria feels like a rebellion. It's a crack in the glass of certainty, a reminder that not everything is neatly archived in the cloud. Some things remain just out of reach, teasing, luminous, half-remembered. Let's be honest, the modern world isn't built for mystery. We live in an age of answers. Every question has a search bar waiting to solve it in half a second, and yet deep down, we miss not knowing. We miss wonder. We miss the feeling that the world is bigger than our understanding. Tartaria gives us that feeling back. It's a paradox. We're surrounded by more information than any civilization in history, and somehow we trust less of it. We have satellite maps of every mountain, street view of every alley, but we still find ourselves staring at old maps labeled Grand Tartary and thinking, maybe something's missing. Maybe history isn't as linear as it pretends to be, and who can blame us? The past is always a little blurry, like a photograph printed from a damaged negative. Historians do their best to fill the gaps, but even the most rigorous scholarship leaves shadows. Tartaria slips into those shadows, into the empty spaces between what we know and what we feel. There's also a quiet beauty in unanswered questions. They remind us that curiosity itself is a form of connection. When someone spends years digging through forgotten archives, zooming into grainy satellite images, or exploring the ruins of an abandoned palace, they're not just chasing facts, they're chasing wonder. They're trying to feel something vast and timeless, something that hums beneath the noise of everyday life. Tartaria gives people permission to believe that the world might still hold secrets. That's why even skeptics can't quite bring themselves to dismiss it entirely, because even if it's not true in a historical sense, it's true in a psychological one. It's the same impulse that made ancient people draw constellations in the stars, to impose meaning on the infinite and find comfort in the patterns. Imagine yourself walking through an old European city at night. The cobblestones glisten after rain. Gas lamps flicker against the carved faces of forgotten gods on building facades. You look up, and the skyline feels impossibly ancient. Arches, domes, and spires stacked like a dream you can't quite interpret. You don't know who built it. You don't need to. The mystery itself is enough. It's like hearing a song in a language you don't understand but somehow recognize. Tartaria lives in that feeling. The hum between knowing and not knowing. The soft echo of lost craftsmanship, the sense that time might be a loop and we're just tracing paths our ancestors already walked. And the irony is, the more we learn about history, the more mysterious it becomes. Every discovery opens 10 new questions. Every answer reveals how much we don't know. The ruins of Göbekli Tepe pushed back the dawn of civilization by thousands of years. The Antikythera mechanism rewrote what we thought the ancients could build. Maybe Tartaria doesn't exist, but the idea that civilizations rise and vanish, leaving traces we mistake for impossibilities, isn't so far-fetched after all. Even the skeptics, the scientists, the historians, they're chasing the same thing as the dreamers. They just call it research instead of mystery. But deep down, it's the same hunger to understand what came before, to find meaning in the ruins. There's a gentle wisdom in letting some mysteries remain mysterious. Not every story has to be resolved. Not every legend needs to be disproven. Some things are more beautiful when they stay slightly out of focus. Tartaria belongs to that realm, the twilight between history and imagination. Because here's the truth. Even if we mapped every ruin, deciphered every language, catalogued every artifact, we'd still find ourselves asking, what's missing? What did we overlook? What used to be here? And that question, that ache, is what keeps humanity moving forward. It's what drives us to explore, to create, to tell stories at all. Mystery, in a strange way, keeps us human. It reminds us that we don't control everything, that there are still edges to the map, and in a world that feels increasingly small, that's a comfort. So if you ever feel the pull of Tartaria, the urge to look at an old map and imagine lost cities under the soil, buried glass domes beneath the ice, vanished languages whispered through time, don't resist it. It's not foolishness, it's memory dressed as wonder. It's the part of you that still wants to believe there's more to the story, because there always is. Imagine drifting in that half-awake space between dreaming and memory, the kind where time doesn't quite make sense and faces blur into landscapes. That's what the myth of Tartaria feels like, a collective dream stitched together from ruins, half-forgotten books, and the quiet yearning that maybe, just maybe, humanity once built something beautiful and lost it. Not just an empire, but an idea. Tartaria isn't really about maps or mud floods. It's about longing, the longing for a golden age before the noise, before the smog, before the blinking lights of modern anxiety. A world where cities gleamed, not with plastic and neon, but with purpose, where architecture felt alive, humming with mystery, where the air itself seemed to remember something divine. When people talk about Tartaria, they're really talking about home, a home they've never seen but somehow recognize. It's tempting, isn't it, to imagine that once there was a civilization so advanced it left behind the blueprints of paradise, smooth white marble gleaming under perpetual sunlight, towers spiraling toward the heavens, not in arrogance but in harmony, streets where water flowed instead of traffic, and knowledge wasn't locked in institutions but breathed like air. The myth whispers that maybe humanity peaked, fell, and forgot, and maybe we're just children trying to remember the lullaby our ancestors sang before the storm. Let's be clear though, Tartaria, as the internet tells it, probably didn't exist, but the feeling of it does. That's what matters. Because myths are just dreams that cultures refuse to wake up from. They serve a purpose, especially in times like ours, when everything feels impermanent, synthetic, and accelerated. Tartaria slows the world down. It reminds us of the beauty of mystery, craftsmanship, and the sense that not everything has to be profit or progress. There's a kind of poetic justice in the way this myth took shape online, in the strangest corners of the internet. A digital ghost story for the digital age. Scroll long enough through photos of ornate buildings with impossible domes and buried windows, and you'll feel it too, that little flicker of awe. Even if your rational mind rolls its eyes, your imagination leans in. What if, it whispers, what if this really was part of something greater? The myth resonates because we're surrounded by ruins and don't realize it. The old train stations, the opera houses, the abandoned civic buildings with ceilings painted like cathedrals, they still stand, silent and out of place. They belong to an age that believed in permanence, in beauty as a civic duty, and compared to that, our world of glass and rectangles feels hollow. Tartaria becomes a name we give that feeling, the ache for artistry, for meaning carved in stone. But beneath the aesthetic nostalgia is something deeper, a memory not of buildings, but of belonging. When people say they erased Tartaria, what they're really mourning is the loss of connection, the sense that we were part of something coherent, meaningful, and vast. We feel fragmented now, nations arguing, truths dissolving, the past rewritten every week on social media. Tartaria becomes a symbol of unity we've misplaced, the dream that once we all spoke the same unspoken language, the language of creation instead of consumption. Maybe that's why the myth refuses to die. It's not a conspiracy, it's a yearning, a collective homesickness for a world that valued wisdom over noise. Whether it's a literal memory or a psychological echo doesn't matter. Myths like this are emotional fossils. They preserve what facts forget. If you strip away the maps and theories, what remains is something tender. The belief that we can do better, that humanity once built something sublime, not through domination, but through understanding, and that maybe we can again. It's less about recovering a lost empire and more about remembering how to build meaning into our world. And maybe, in a strange roundabout way, the myth is right. There was a flood, a metaphorical one, the flood of time, technology, and forgetfulness. It buried not cities, but attention. It drowned not buildings, but wonder. And now, through whispers of Tartaria, people are trying to dig it back up. Not the structures, but the feeling of awe they carried. Picture the end of the dream, an endless step at dusk. The horizon glows gold, and somewhere in the distance, faint towers shimmer through the haze. They're not ruins, not anymore, just echoes of possibility. You start walking toward them, though you know you'll never reach them. That's Tartaria, not a destination, but a direction. Not history, but hope. And as you drift toward sleep, remember this. Every civilization is both a memory and a prophecy. What we imagine today shapes what we build tomorrow. So maybe Tartaria isn't behind us. It's ahead, waiting to be remembered not as a lost empire, but as an invitation to build again, but slower, kinder, wiser, to carve beauty into the world and mean it this time. Because deep down, that's all the myth ever wanted, to remind us that the most eternal things aren't marble or empire, but imagination itself. The quiet, persistent dream that we came from something extraordinary, and that we can still be. So now, as the story fades and the dream of Tartaria settles like evening mist, take a moment, breathe slowly, let the world around you grow quiet. The hum of the present softens, and for a brief, weightless instant, it feels as though time itself exhales. What have we really been chasing tonight? A vanished empire? A mystery hidden in maps and marble? Or something smaller, quieter? Something that hums inside us when we stare at old buildings and feel inexplicably that we've been here before? Tartaria may never have existed on any official timeline, but in another sense, it's never stopped existing. It lives in the empty plazas at dawn, when the light hits old stone just right, and the world feels ancient again. It lives in the symmetry of cathedrals, the curve of forgotten domes, the echo of a song hummed in a language no one remembers. It lives in us, the builders, the dreamers, the rememberers. And maybe that's the truth behind all forgotten civilizations. They never really vanish, they just move inward into the imagination. Every myth is a refuge, a way of saying, once we were capable of beauty. Once we remembered how to build with our hearts. So as you lie there now, listening to the quiet between sentences, imagine those impossible cities, half marble, half memory. The air is cool, the towers glow faintly, their reflections trembling in still water. Somewhere in the distance, bells ring, soft as wind chimes, a civilization asleep, waiting to be remembered. Let yourself drift there for a while, between the known and the forgotten, between myth and truth, between what was and what could be, because that's where Tartaria lives, not in the history books, but in the gentle space between waking and dreaming. The world outside your window may look ordinary, but beneath it runs the same current that built empires, painted ceilings, and told stories by firelight. It's the same desire to make meaning from the chaos, to leave something beautiful behind, even if no one remembers who built it. So rest easy. You don't need to solve the mystery tonight. You don't need to decide what was real and what was legend. Just breathe and listen. The past has a rhythm, slow and steady, like the tide, like a heartbeat. It's the sound of humanity remembering itself. Tomorrow the noise will return, screens, traffic, chatter. But tonight belongs to silence, to candlelight, to the soft pulse of an imaginary empire that refuses to die. Tartaria is gone, but also eternal, an echo across time reminding us that wonder is its own kind of truth. And as your eyes grow heavy, think of it this way. Maybe the greatest lost civilization isn't buried under mud or stone. Maybe it's the one inside us, waiting to be uncovered again. A world built not from power, but from awe. Good night, dreamer. Sleep well under ancient skies. And if you find yourself walking through those shining cities again, don't rush. Stay a while. The empire of imagination is always open.